On the eastern front near Bakhmut, Ukraine's military says this push helped its soldiers liberate another square kilometer of territory. The counteroffensive grinds on steady but slow, adding to the urgency of President Volodymyr Zelensky's pleas for more help. This year, he says, we must do everything to start negotiations on Ukraine's future membership in the EU. The same applies to NATO. Zelensky's demand is front and center ahead of this week's NATO meeting. But the U.S. is soundly rejecting Ukraine's request.
I don't think it's ready for membership in NATO. But
President Joe Biden says Ukraine can't join NATO until the war is over. Otherwise, he says the conflict would expand based on the founding NATO principle that an attack on one is an attack on all.
If the war is going on, then we're all in a war. We're at war with Russia, if that were the case.
Biden hopes Ukraine's disappointment will be somewhat tempered by his controversial decision to send cluster munitions to the front lines. When fired, they release small bombs that can explode years later, posing a risk to civilians. Canada doesn't support their use, neither does the UK.
The UK is signatory to a convention which prohibits the production or use of cluster munitions and discourages their use. We will continue to do our part to support Ukraine.
Biden will discuss this with the British Prime Minister. He landed in London for meetings ahead of the NATO summit. He's expected to pass along assurances from Ukraine that the weapons won't be used in civilian areas, and Ukraine's claims they aren't nearly as brutal as Russian tactics.
There is nothing worse than tortures, rapes, and everything that Russians do on the territories they occupy, and we need to liberate as quick as possible.
And Katie, there's another country looking to join NATO that Biden is concerned about.
Yeah, at this moment, it's unclear what's going to happen with Sweden. Turkey is still not ready to grant approval. On a phone call, President Erdogan told President Biden that Sweden is taking some steps in the right direction with changes to its anti-terrorism legislation. Turkey has long accused Sweden of being too lenient with certain terrorist organizations that are banned in Turkey. Biden and Erdogan will chat again in person on the sidelines of the summit. Washington wants to get this done as quickly as possible. Ian.
All right. Thank you.
As Katie mentioned, this is the first time that Canada has objected to any arms transfer by an ally to Ukraine, but it's not really surprising that Canada would take that stand because Canada is more than just a signatory to the cluster munitions ban. In fact, it was one of the forces behind it. The 2008 Oslo Treaty that banned cluster bombs is really an outgrowth of an earlier Ottawa landmine ban treaty that was a landmark achievement of a previous Liberal government. In the end, though, this transfer is very likely to go through. Now, another issue that we're expecting to hear about at the summit is about money, and there are indications that Canada is going to feel renewed pressure to finally live up to the commitment that it made at the NATO summit in Wales in 2014 that commits it to spend at least 2% of its gross domestic product on defense. Right now, Canada is really bringing up the rear among the larger countries, the larger members of NATO. Many smaller countries also failed to meet that target. But of the 6 G7 countries that are also members of NATO, Canada is in 6th place with only 1.29% of its GDP currently going to defense. Since it's been 10 years since that summit, Canada can point to some progress in the early years, but stalled really in its movement towards that target around the year 2017. So what we're expecting to see is that countries that already meet and exceed the 2% spending mark, countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, will be putting pressure on Canada to at least resume movement in the right direction. Evan Dyer, CBC News, Ottawa.